You know, a few months ago, we did the Universal Monster Dead Last, and it was a lot of fun. So I figured that the next logical step would be to continue on with it and look at how Hammer redefined all those characters. Like, you see, they took the rights and basically made their own versions. So I thought we should rank those, concentrating on the first entry of each of the big names they remade. And then threw in a couple of other of their more popular originals. So here's the roster that I went with. Now, keep in mind, there's a ton of other Hammer horror films out there, including sequels to some of these. So there's room to do a follow-up in the future. But I had to keep it to a reasonable number for my patrons to rank. And they did rank them. And here's the roster of those that chose to participate. Something that you can do as well by becoming a patron on patreon.com/movietimelines. For as little as $1 a month, we do a different list every single month. And this month, 27 people answered the call, which means that the best score that a movie can have would be 27 points. And that would be as if everyone that participated chose the same #1 movie, something that has never happened in the history of the show. We've never had a sweep. And the worst score, if everyone chose the same dead last, again, something that has never happened, it would have 324 points. So, here we go. Check it out. Or, I guess I should say,
Stop! Hammer time!
Coming in at our dead last position here with a pretty low spot with 244 points. We have a pretty clear, I guess we'll say, winner with the Reptile. It took the largest amount of dead lasts, ranked there 8 times, and the best score that it got was 4th place, which it took twice. And this is the only film on the entire roster that didn't get any 1st or 2nd place spots. Every other film here had someone give it either 1 or 2, but not the Reptile. And I shared that sentiment since it was my dead last as well. And I'll tell you right now that I pretty much enjoyed all the films on this list. This was one of the more overall enjoyable rosters that we've had for a while. And I got some pleasure out of almost all of them. And I say almost because, man, I did not enjoy the Reptile. First of all, I watched this right after the Gorgon, which we'll talk about later, but this has the same basic setup of a plot. It's like, oh, hey, some people are dead in the town and we need to investigate, and everything seems to lead to this old castle location. But the difference here is just how slow this all goes. The plot just seems to move along at a fairly leisurely pace, and at least it has that cool Hammer atmosphere going for it, but all of these do, so it's not like this one's going to get extra points for that. And in terms of the story, for a movie called The Reptile, you're really not giving me too much of that Reptile. And I guess that would be okay if you were giving me, well, anything else. But if you're moving this slow, you would at least have to give me some cool creature stuff. And that creature is cool. The design is pretty wild, and I guess molded off of a real snakeskin. Although it's like they kind of gave up after doing the face and then just put her in some dress instead of doing a cool full body design. But not only do they not feature her enough in the movie, but she doesn't even have enough to do. She's sidelined and made the B villain in her own story, which diminishes it all for me. Throw in the fact that you're not getting any of those Hammer regulars like Lee or Cushing, and then the cast you do have just doesn't seem to be all that interested in what they're doing anyway. And you don't have a terrible movie, but you do have a pretty unremarkable one. And on this list, that's getting you dead last. Okay, with our last placer, our dead last, out of the way, I'll tell you that I genuinely like every other film on this list. And we had a drop down of almost 20 points with our number 11 film, one that we did twice before in the Universal list, and it's The Phantom of the Opera. It was only ranked in dead last 3 times, but it did manage to get 1 first place spot. And I guess, another spoiler, there's a lot of single first place votes all the way down this collection of films. But I had this one pretty low myself since I put it in 9th place, and like I said, we've already watched versions of The Phantom for the Universal list. 2, in fact. And there's just no way to watch this without comparing it to those. And it makes sense since there was like around a 20-year difference between the 25 version and the 43 one, and then this one came around in 62, so there's a similar time jump here. And here's where I start that whole comparison thing that I was talking about. When you take a look at the 25 version versus the 43, they're drastically different in terms of look and feel. The original was a silent film, in fact, and black and white and super gothic looking. But then the 43 version comes along and gives it this big Technicolor look and makes it even more bright and dramatic and even operatic. But then there's this 20-year jump or so, and then you have this one, so you're expecting some bold revision or a different take, but then you watch this, and yeah, it's essentially the same thing as the 43 one. Like, it looks similar, plays similar, and does a lot of the same tricks that that one did. It's not until the final 10 minutes or so that this one really differentiates itself with its switch up in terms of the motivation of the Phantom. Like, it's interesting that this is the one that plays up the sympathetic aspect of the character, since it's also the one that seems to drop the romanticism and make him a monster. I mean, at least, like I said, until the end. There is one moment that truly stands out, though, as something pretty fantastic, and it's that hanging sequence. But I had to raise this up a bit higher because I did think that Herbert Lom really played that well. And like I said, they made him pretty brutal in the early parts and then try to redeem him at the end. And it's Lom's performance that sells that. He always had a way of making you feel bad for pretty horrible people. And of course, was great casting here. I have to say, I wish I liked that mask more, though. Our number 10 movie here, dropping down close to another 20 points to 208, and we're checking out one that I think may have the best title here. Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. And this one got 3 dead last votes, and the best score that it achieved was 2nd place, which it got once. And I put this one higher than Phantom, and it got my 8th place spot. And this one is pretty fun and silly, and I have to say that it is officially the horniest of the Hammer flicks. It may not be the sexiest of the roster, as we'll discuss in a bit, but damn, everyone in this movie is looking to get busy, most notably the captain himself. But there's a lot to like here, since there's this whole development of the vampire lore going on that I thought was pretty unique. In this one, there were different types of vampires that preyed on people, and first, as a vampire hunter, you'd have to figure out what kind killed a person so that then you could determine which method to use to kill it. And that's pretty neat, although it's not like that's a major part of the movie, but it's in a way a justification for vampire cinema in general. Like, from film to film, the rules the vampires follow in terms of how they're killed, the way they kill, all that fluctuates. And that's obviously because they're different companies and filmmakers and such. But this movie basically explains it for you and gives you a reason why. Like, this isn't something that's super lore heavy. Like, in fact, it's pretty light on plot. It's essentially just a loose collection of a string of adventures, all with the captain, and bonus points for getting Carolyn Monroe in there. But I guess that this was intended to be the first part of a series, but just wasn't successful enough to get a follow-up. And the director intended this one to be a sort of world-defining entry to lay the groundwork for more. But that's the movie biz, I guess. I tell you one thing, though. This movie has one of the coolest scenes in Hammer history, with Caps taking out a couple of dudes in a bar with a single sword slash. All right, let's drop down to our number 9 movie here. And this was a really close one with a difference of 1 point. And this movie was our number 10 entry until the very final list gave it a solid score and gave it the boost over Captain Kronos. And with 207 points, 1 less than the Captain, we're looking at The Abominable Snowman. People were super split over this one since it got 6 dead last, the second highest amount, but also got first place once and several other really high scores. And I was one of those since I put this one in 3rd. And look, I get it if you weren't that into this one. I get it. It probably comes off as a touch slow and feels more like a play at times with its limited sets, but hot damn do I love it anyway. Maybe it's because of my affinity for The Thing, but movies set in a big snow-covered wasteland really appeal to me, and this one does a great job of conveying that whole atmosphere, that bleak, white surrounding area and feeling of being stranded and alone. And I tell you, the black and white photography goes a long way with really convincing you of that. Everything just feels stark and barren to me, and I know that like this isn't a studio and they're not really out in the snow, and the backdrops look like sets, but that just adds to it for me. But the whole big selling point for me is the scary is what you don't see thing that I appreciated so much in Jaws and wish a lot of other films would learn from. You never get a solid look at our Yeti in this one, and they just give you these quick glimpses of them, and that's what makes it more effective. There's this one shot of just an arm, and it's shown just enough for you to get an idea of what the rest of it looks like, and it's pretty damn cool. And this is our first movie on the list that features Peter Cushing, but it sure as hell won't be the last. And although he doesn't exactly have the most juicy role here, he plays it very well and helps sell that whole lost in the snow thing. But I think that the thing that I dug here is that this is less of a creature feature and more of a psychological one, which is the case with a few others on this list. And in some of the others, I feel like that worked against them. Like instead of giving us the monsters, they stick us with people sitting around talking. But since the vibe here is supposed to be isolation and a building tension, that works for it more than those others, for me. Our number 8 film is also pretty close in numbers, but not like single point close, since it dropped 8 points down to 199. And it's one that I was surprised ended up so low, because we're looking at The Mummy from 1959. And this one was only ranked in the dead last spot 1 time, so not too much, but it did get 1 first place vote as well. And I put this one in 6th place, and I thought that I was going to be one of the lower rankings for this one, but it turns out that I was very, very wrong. And again, I think that there's a certain amount of comparing that you have to do here with the Universal versions, and whereas this is definitely ahead of the original version, it still has some issues that hold it back and things I'm not crazy about. Like one thing I will say though, and I mentioned this with the Universal one, is that the whole desert Egyptian setting kind of goes against either of the studio's whole vibe. Like both brands are built around a dark gothic atmosphere, which is something that the whole sunny middle of the desert outside of an archaeological dig doesn't directly lend itself to. But honestly, for the most part, they made this work. And it's likely because not much of the runtime sticks with the desert setting, and they move away from that into a more standard backdrop. But just when it seems like they're hitting all the right notes, they take this weird right turn into backstory land and give us this whole overly long extended flashback showing how the mummy got to be the mummy, which just amounts to, hey, we got Christopher Lee to play the mummy, so we can't just have him wrapped up and silent for the entire time, or what else was the point? So we end up with this whole bit with Lee in brownface telling us how the mummy got to be a mummy, when what we really want is to see that mummy running around and killing peoples. Because when they do that, that's when the film rocks. That they actually went ahead and made the mummy a genuinely menacing creature, since he's not this slow, lumbering lummox of a character just walking around towards people like a Romero zombie. I mean, he does that sometimes, but not when the script needs him to. And like for the most part, I think if you told someone that a mummy was coming for them, judging from the majority of movies featuring one, you're just like, okay, I'll just keep away from that guy. But maybe not this one. This one will get you. And also, besides Lee, you have Cushing in this one too. The first one on the list to feature them both. Definitely not the last. And watching them go toe to toe is always a treat.
What's the matter?
It's extraordinary. I've never noticed it before, but with your hair like that, you're the image of a nunca.
Henry?
She was considered the most beautiful woman in the world.
Oh, I am flattered.
Mind you, the world wasn't so big then.
Coming in at number 7, it's another one that shocked me with being down this low because it's another heavy hitter. And with 187 points, we're looking at The Curse of the Werewolf. Just like The Mummy, this is one that was ranked in dead last a single time and also put in first place a single time. So again, a wide range of opinions here. And I had this one a bit higher and also one above where I put The Mummy. And I had this one in 5th place myself. And this one is wacky and I love its oddness. Like 2 things to mention really quick. The first thing is that this is the very first werewolf movie to be filmed in color, which is a minor historical note, but one nonetheless. But unlike the other Universal monsters that Hammer took over, this one didn't get any follow-ups. I mean, I guess Phantom too, but he's never been like a sequelized character. But like Universal did a bunch of Franks, Draculas, Mummies, Wolfmans, and Hammer followed suit, except Wolfie. Just one for him. And maybe it's because of just how weird this one is. Because the weirdest thing about this one is just how damn long it takes to have anything to do with a werewolf. I mean, if you haven't seen it, let me recap. You have to see this rich dick and his wife, and you have to see them torture a beggar and then imprison him. And then you have to know that he's down there for decades. And then a servant girl is stuck in his cage. She's raped and barely escapes, but gives birth, but dies. And then that baby grows up to discover that he is, in fact, a werewolf, which is just a whole lot of extra steps to explain this curse. It takes a full third of the film to explain this. And the majority of it really isn't all that necessary to get across what they're trying to convey. Like, bear in mind, that's 4 time periods. There's the opening bit with the beggar. A long time later, after he's been in there for a while, so there's like a 20-year time jump. Then the post-birth and a young Liam, so like another 10-year time jump. And then the 4th with an adult Liam, probably yet another 10 years. We don't get a werewolf scene until a full hour into the movie. I mean, sure, we get some teases, like setting up the idea that there's a werewolf out there, but it doesn't actually happen on screen until the movie's almost done. And I realize that I'm making it sound like it's this terrible thing, but honestly, the sheer goofiness of it all is pretty fun. It's really hard to say that it follows a formula, that's for sure, and it's definitely reinventing the concept of the Wolfman and not just rolling with the whole, oh, this dude was bitten by another Wolfman, which earns it some points, and it's a solid good time. This next one, coming in at our number 6 spot, surprised me in the opposite way because it's a lesser known one, and coming in with 181 points, 6 points lower than the werewolf, it's the Gorgon. This is the first one on the list that didn't get any dead last votes, one of only 3 movies here to do so, and the lowest score it got was 11th place, which it did take 4 times. Like the others above it though, it also grabbed 1 first place nod. And this is one that I had a bit lower since I put it in 10th place, but that said, this is one that I did like, just not as much as some of the others. But can we just acknowledge that this is a movie about the Gorgon, and they made her into a horror movie villain. Like most of the other Hammer flicks are either revamps of the Universal villains or ones that they made up like the Reptile or just variations of basic vampires. But this is taking an actual mythological character and making her the primary antagonist of a horror flick, and that's unique. And what's weird is that the whole idea of the Gorgons and Medusa in general is one that I'm kind of shocked that we haven't seen more of. But in terms of how this one plays out, it has a few issues that I had a bit of a hard time getting around, even if the flick in general was still a good time. But it's got a problem with figuring out who the main character is. You're sort of following one guy, and it seems like he's the lead, But then he's killed off, and then there's a random assortment of other dudes, and you're never really sure who you're supposed to be following. But earlier I had mentioned just how much that this one feels like the Reptile, and I watched this one first, and this was by far the better executed of the two basically similar plot lines. But just like the Reptile, this one has an issue with being a Gorgon movie without enough Gorgonzola. And I don't mean in the way that I'm talking about with Abominable Snowman. It's not like they're giving you cool teases of the creature and then sort of building the tension and plot in the surrounding scenes. No, I mean that the villain plays into things very little. The storyline just wants to revolve around everything but her, which is a shame because the Gorgon itself is a highlight and the whole turning to stone aspect is pretty cool. Going down to our number 5 movie now, and this is back into a more solid drop down in points as this one went down to 165, about 15 less than the Gorgon. And it's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. You know people were split here since it got 3 dead last votes, tying our number 11 movie for amounts of times in that spot. But in contrast, it also got 3 first place spots. And I had this one down lower since I put it in 11th place, but honestly, I do enjoy this, and the distance between my number 11 and my dead last was pretty wide. Like, out of all of the Universal redos, I think this is the one that really took a jump with deciding to play with the concept. Like, sure, you had Curse of the Werewolf messing with the lore and stuff, but this was really taking the original in a different direction, and just by the title alone, seems to be shouting pretty loudly, hey, this is different. Instead of having this scientist transforming into his most base instincts and darker self, you have him turning into a woman, but requiring the blood of another woman to maintain it. And the setup for this one has so much potential. The whole concept just lends itself to so many interesting scenarios and weird situations to lead into. And when they do that first transformation scene, it's pretty great. Like sure, it's kind of easy now to figure out exactly how they did it, but it still catches you off guard, gives you a little surprise. But then they go down a weird path of trying to do too much, but then not really trying enough. Like they throw in Jack the Ripper and Burke and Hare into the mix, but then don't really do much with either one of those and just drop them. But then there's the biggest reason for putting this down so low. After giving us this different setup, it then fails to do anything cool with it and then just sort of plays out like the original classic tale. The whole turning into a woman aspect doesn't even affect how everything happens. It's just, here's Jekyll and Hyde, but Hyde's a woman, and that's as far as we take it. And I guess I was just let down by it all, considering that it seemed like I was in for a wild ride with some gender wackiness, and they certainly promised me that with the title and all, but then you just do Jekyll and Hyde, and you wonder why they bothered. This was another very close call and another 1-point battle, with our number 4 movie getting 164 points versus Sister Hyde's 165, and it's Twins of Evil. And this is another one that received 1 dead last and also 1 first place vote. And I had this one around the middle since I had it in 7th, and this one is pretty fun. I mean, you're giving me uptight religious jerk versus a swinging Lothario Karnstein, so what's not to like? Side note, how nice would it have been to be Peter Cushing and just have that level of job security where he was like, oh yeah, sure, Hammer, what are you gonna do? Make a movie without me? Sure, go ahead. Enjoy The Reptile, see how that turns out. And it's pretty great to watch all of these because they didn't just pigeonhole Cushing into the same role over and over. He plays a wide variety of character types and personalities, so it must have been fun to really stretch his acting and do different things. And he plays a great devilish prick here versus a sort of roguish opponent, but my biggest issue is that I think that Karnstein isn't supposed to really be a good guy or anything, and most of the film is sort of Karnstein versus Gustav and his crew, so you kind of want to root for Karnstein, but the movie wants to make Anton the hero, and he's a bit of a drip. So you have this whole dynamic of, well, the 2 characters that are interesting to me are kind of not the people that I'm supposed to be on the side of. So you get a bit lost in it. The plot has some fun going on, though, even though with the title of the movie is Twins of Evil. Well, there's only one that's actually evil, but it becomes a question of which one. And you've got the role of the twins played by real-life twins. And you know, this is kind of an anomaly with the Hammer films because, for the most part, they're very religion-friendly films. Obviously, in the other vampire stuff and demon things, there's a strong bent towards the religious aspect being helpful, and crosses and divine intervention play a positive role. But this is the only one I can think of where the church members are portrayed in a negative light, going around and killing anyone they think is a witch, and it stands out a bit with the rest of their catalog. Oh, and it's pretty clear that Hammer knew what they were doing. They're like, we're calling this Twins of Evil, and we're casting twins and all, but we're also going to make sure there's a ton of shots of cleavage in these little nightgowns. Here we go, top 3 time, and the points are about to jump like crazy, but not quite yet. But our number 3 movie dropped down almost another 20 points to 147. And it's another one that stands out here, and it's The Hound of the Baskerville. This one actually did get 2 dead last votes, but also 1 first place vote, and a lot of higher rankings as well. And I was one of those higher rankings since I put this one in second. And yeah, I might have a strong nostalgic attachment to this one. I can't say this with any accuracy, but I'm pretty sure that this is the first Hammer film that I ever saw. I can say that it was the first Sherlock Holmes thing that I ever saw. So when anyone talks about the character, this is the image that I go to. And you know, it seems obvious, but Hammer and Holmes are the perfect mixture. Maybe not for every Holmes story, but that gothic countryside atmosphere just lends itself so well to this tale in particular. And Cushing just nails it as Sherlock. It's a role that he would go on to play again 10 years later in a TV series. But this is just such a great mixture of the other roles that he's played here. He's got that cocky arrogance that his Frankenstein has, but also that confidence and heroism of his Van Helsing. Seeing how well he rocked this one, I'm kind of shocked that Hammer didn't just say, let's make Cushing our regular Holmes and pump out a bunch of these, but this was their only one. But then you throw in Christopher Lee, but I'll admit that not nearly enough. And one interesting thing here is that unlike their Frankenstein and Dracula, they're not trying to avoid doing the same thing. In those, there was sort of a need to switch it up a bit, but not here, and they're able to give a pretty faithful adaptation of the source material. Not that they didn't have their own stylistic flares, but for the most part, this is the classic Holmes story brought to life and done really well. And it's kind of weird that this is in here, considering that most of the Hammer output around this time was classic horror monsters and also original creature tales, but yeah, mostly monsters. So it's an interesting switch up then to just throw in an adaptation of some old school literature. And also neat to consider that when this film was made, this story was old school literature and was like 60 years old already. Only 2 movies left, and this next one had a pretty big drop, and we only have 2 of the big boys left, the icons of horror. And with an almost 40 points difference at 109, we're checking out The Curse of Frankenstein. This never got ranked dead last, and in fact, the lowest score it got was 9th place, but it was ranked in 1st place 4 times. And I had this one pretty well placed myself since I put this one in 4th place, and I really dig this one because there's a lot of good stuff going on here, but I have to say that there's parts of it that fall pretty short for me. Like for one, I'm not a fan of the monster's makeup. Like the whole look of the creature was something that they clearly had to switch up, and they took a bold jump away from the original Universal take, but what they went with was just uninspired. Like I understand that they didn't just want to do the same thing as before, but that look is so iconic, and this just looks like, I don't know, a zombie or something. Like I just don't look at this Frankenstein, except for I guess some stitches on his face, but more so than that, like the portrayal just isn't as sympathetic as I would hope here. Like the way Cushing plays the Doctor is phenomenal, and he's such a prick in this, and his morality is much less gray than the original tale. But the creature just doesn't have that innocent air that you got from Karloff, and considering that that's the point of the novel and such, it just doesn't come across here. Like, you can't totally be on the side of the monster because they treat him more like a monster and less an innocent victim. So you're not really on his side. But then the Doctor is way more malicious than the original, and you're clearly not on his side. And the movie definitely wants you to recognize him as the villain here, so you're not rooting for him either. So like a couple others on this list, you're not sure whose side you're supposed to be on. Although I confess that it's delightful to see Cushing just play over-the-top evil and play Frankenstein like the mad scientist that he's rarely allowed to be. I just wish that they had a more sympathetic monster to balance that out. This is one that I almost wish that I included one of the sequels, since I think that they improved upon this one, but I just stuck to the first entries. And you know, even with all that I said here, I do still love this movie. It really nails the proper atmosphere and those mad laboratories and the feel of this village town.
Get away from me!
And that brings us to our final film, our number one, the top of the charts here, and it was a blowout. This film, the only one left here, dropped another 40 points to 69. Nice. And it's the Horror of Dracula. Like Frank, it also never took a dead last, but it did get one 8th place vote and also was ranked in first 13 times, almost half of the rankings. And I was one of those 13 first place votes because this is also my number one. And this is The Way You Do Dracula. This is awesome. And I love that the way this starts off and it's all like, oh, hey, this is Dracula. You know this story and we're doing our version of that. Like, look, see, it has Harker going to see Dracula. And the whole first sequence is sort of a redo of the Universal version. And you think you know where they're going. And they're doing a pretty straight remake. But then they throw out a twist with Harker being a vampire hunter, and you realize that it's not a straight adaptation, and almost everything after this goes in its own direction. I have to say, though, that it's weird that in most of the Hammer Dracula series, Lee plays Dracula as silent and just like this unstoppable monster. So it's strange to see him in the beginning here as this eloquently speaking dude. It's kind of weird even in the context of this movie. He's all chatty and dignified for the opening and seems like a pretty regular guy. But then he turns the corner and let me tell you, the first time they show him vamped up is just terrifying. That one shot pretty much defines the Lee version of this character. From this point on, he's essentially just a silent, relentless killing machine. And it's almost like he's a different character. I'm not saying that as a negative thing, though, because I think that it's motivated by the story, but it's still an interesting thing to note, particularly if you watch the later films and see him silent in them, so it stands out. And another thing, with the exception of the werewolf, in each of the big monster movies, you're getting a face-off with Lee and Cushing. They made Lee the mummy and had the two tussle, and that was great. They made Lee the monster and had him fight Cushing, and that was great. And here, they're making Lee Dracula, and they're duking it out as probably the most epic of all of them, and it stands out. Like, their final battle here is probably the thing I remember the most about this entire series. And for all of the flack that the Universal Dracula gets for having a disappointing ending, this movie was like, hell no, we're not falling into that trap. We're giving you something to remember us by. So there you have it, a dozen Hammers ranked up, and I'm pretty happy with this roster. Let's take a look. I guess the thing is that I enjoy almost all of these ones, but not like passionately. So none of these rankings bug me. Like, there's a couple I would switch around, but there's nothing that I'm like, oh hey, that doesn't belong that high or whichever. Like, this looks about right. But, you know, let us know how you would have ranked them or what you don't agree with. Put that down below in the comments. If you didn't get a chance to rank these or are new to the thing and haven't been a patron, let us know down below in the comments what you would have changed or how your ranking would have been. Or if you were a patron, let us know how you did rank them. Put that down below in the comments. I'd like to see it. And also leave me comments just about what you thought about the video and the Hammer movies in general. Also, if you liked this video, hit the like button. If you enjoy the channel, hit subscribe. And like I said, go to patreon.com/movietimelines and help support the channel. And you can become one of the patrons that ranks these videos every single month. But you can also just keep coming back and watching these videos. I appreciate that. See you very shortly for another great one. Thanks. Bye-bye.